Truly incredible things are happening in China. And gradually, we in the West are seeing more and more of them. The huge rise of internet connectivity across the country has meant that you can now see literally billions of fragments of Chinese life online. But these fragments scarcely add up to a coherent picture of this astonishingly complex country. And such a scattered and algorithmically picked view risks being both shallow and orientalising. And we've certainly not always been able to see into China so easily. In one of the most arresting moments of recent global history, when the Chinese government ordered its COVID lockdowns, almost all foreign journalists were expelled. Yuan Yang remained, one of the few journalists writing in English left in the whole country. As deputy Beijing Bureau Chief for the Financial Times, she remained documenting an increasingly authoritarian government, as well as its undeniably vast achievements. Now she's back with a book, Private Revolutions, which tells the stories of 4 young women coming of age in a China transformed. It's a richly textured history of the present, written in that often missing ground between the abstraction of statistics and the arbitrariness of anecdotes. She's also the Labour Party candidate in the upcoming election for the new constituency of Earley and Woodley. My name's Richard Hames, and on this episode of Novara FM, Yuan told me about the long scars of the Cultural Revolution, how the dream of becoming rich became contagious, and why the left's romanticisation of China is a dead end. Yuan Yang, welcome to Novara FM.
Thanks for having me.
So I have a problem about the way in which I understand China, and I'm hoping that you can, to some extent, solve that problem once and for all for me. The problem is this. I see on the internet, on short video scrolling platforms.
This is just a great start to the problem, Richard.
To be really concrete. I see on the internet tiny flecks of detail of Chinese life. And I delude myself that I understand China, or that I understand the sort of richness of the life world of China. And on the other hand, I've been looking at, for probably 10 years at this point, graphs that have shown me GDP data about China, the enormous transformations of, for example, its energy systems, the huge migrations. I see these numbers of people moving from small towns and villages to cities. I see 100 million people on the move, and I can't put these two scales together. So on the one hand, I have little flecks of detail, little anecdotes, hopelessly isolated. And then on the other hand, I have these sort of bloodless abstractions, the data about China. And I think that what your book does, Private Revolutions, is stitch together those two things in a really exciting way. And so my first question is simply the most basic one, which is, how did you come to write this? And how are you going to solve my problems here?
So I think that tension that you described between the micro, the human lives, and the macro, the kind of systemic shifts, is at the heart of all good social science and economics reporting. And my background's in economics. I started at the Financial Times in 2016 covering the Chinese economy. And I very much wanted to write a book that would bring to life these great shifts that you talk about on the scale of graphs and charts and numbers and figures, but to help transport the reader into the interior lives, or what it feels like to live through essentially the world's biggest economic experiment of our times. And I hope that through doing so, that we can develop a bit more empathy for individual lives, a bit more sense of the narrative of those lives in China. And I think that's, for most people, a better way of making sense of what it feels like to be alive in China today and to have lived through this economic change more than just the economic figures and facts.
Absolutely, yeah. You said it's an experiment, and I'm sort of interested in that characterization of it. What is being experimented with? What are the sort of dimensions of the experiment? What is still not set about the way in which China is developing itself?
Yeah, I think we have to go back to the period just after the end of the Mao era in the late 1970s, when there was a very messy leadership transition, and out of it emerged Deng Xiaoping, the next leader of China, and his reform and opening up experiment. And in retrospect, we kind of see that in some ways as a historically inevitable transition, that China opened up its markets and joined the World Trade Organization. But certainly, if you look at the history of that time, one of my friends and very good historian, Julian Gewirtz, has recently written about the history of that time as being not set in stone, but a series of political experiments that in the beginning, there wasn't that much political support within the Communist Party for, and there was a lot of negotiating and essentially kind of factional, what's the right word? And essentially a lot of factional negotiation and political contingency that went into that eventual opening up. So I do see the history of China's opening up and embrace of market capitalism as being a series of experiments, a series of, the famous Deng Xiaoping phrase, crossing the river by feeling each stone at a time, as opposed to a great, jump into the unknown. And I think that's going on still because it's not clear to what extent President Xi wants to continue that model. And he has certainly ended many forms of the experimentation that existed in his predecessors because he has a much deeper desire for centralized control. And so this balance between experimentation and centralization is still going on in China today.
I want to get into all of that because I find that stuff endlessly fascinating, particularly the sort of the regional distribution of experimentation and the way in which, as far as I understand it, there is a kind of policy that is laid down in rather vague and general terms by the central party, which is then implemented in much freer ways by the regions and by the provinces of China. And then the most successful of those are selected for and then reproduced at the national scale. Is that, broadly speaking, a kind of a very rough characterization of how that experimentation takes place, or is there some other way in which it's
I think that definitely characterizes certain periods in policy experimentation in China, that there'd be, of the 30 plus autonomous regions and provinces that have fairly self-governing mechanisms, and there'd be lots of different trial zones for different things. The special economic zones of Shenzhen and the first parts of China that were opened up to foreign investment being one prime example of that. But lots of different experiments in everything from kind of land to housing policy. I think that feedback from, let's say, the periphery to the center, that loop has broken down quite a lot, I would say, in the last in the last 8 years or so under President Xi, because with the anti-corruption drive and with increasing tightening of political control and ideological control and centralization of it within the Communist Party into one man, into President Xi himself, there's just a lot more fear from the level of regional bureaucrats to do anything apart from read and toe the line of what they see as coming down from up on high. So I think there has been a breakdown in that experimental cycle in the current period, but certainly there was quite a high range of variability of policy implementation in different parts of China, particularly comparing rural and urban areas.
I think this question that you raised earlier of the life world and the sense of how people's lives have been lived, what kinds of environments they live in. Throughout the book, there are these extraordinary details, particularly about the changes in housing, things being suddenly demolished and just disappeared suddenly. Huge changes in the way in which people comport themselves in their environments and feel alienated from them or feel at home in them in different ways. And I want to take us all the way back to the 1930s, right, which is a pre-communist China. We're trying to trace, I think, a movement from what is a period of really quite pronounced poverty through to some really quite astonishing levels of wealth, albeit incredibly unevenly distributed.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could give us a chance to give us an image of what that poverty was like, perhaps even before the Communist Party took power, and therefore what might have motivated the Communist Party to do so in the first place.
Well, one of the characters in the book who in the book is called Sam. So each of the four women that I describe the lives of are pseudonymous in the book for their own safety. Sam answers this question in her own work because she's a sociology student who is really fascinated with the history of the communist era in China and kind of seeks out to answer the question of where did the revolution go wrong, essentially, if you want to put it in simplified terms. And while she's writing her master's thesis, she interviews these retired shipyard workers who are some of the first workers in the state-owned enterprises in China, who in the modern era are now in their kind of 80s, some are in their 90s, and would have been just starting out in terms of work in the 1930s, just before during the Japanese occupation, just before the Communist Revolution of 1949. And she describes a scene that, of course, one of those workers describes to her in retrospect, saying that there was huge unemployment. There was obviously an imperial occupation, and there was a real sense of, post Qing dynasty, after the downfall of the Qing dynasty, and the kind of optimism of the founding of the Republic of China by the Kuomintang government. There was then the descent into corruption in the Kuomintang era, the civil war between the Communist Party and the Kuomintang Party at the same time as there being this continued occupation. And there was, I think at that time, the rise of the Communist Party was also a response to the occupation itself, and the seeking for an anti-imperialist party that would fight for people who had felt also disenfranchised by the Kuomintang ruling party. And Sam describes this scene, let me just restart that. And Sam relays this scene in the center of Shanghai, where there was a big gathering, mostly of unemployed young men, and there was a Communist Party, preacher or proselytizer who was speaking to all the people in the square, telling them, "You are now struggling under the three great mountains," which is a slogan at the time, of imperialism, of capitalism, and of feudalism. Feudalism meaning to stand for all of these, what the Communist Party saw as superstitious, outdated beliefs, cultural baggage that held the country back. And that speech that he made really stuck with one of these unemployed men at the time, who then became, post-Communist Revolution, employed by the shipyard that was then set up on the outskirts of Shanghai. And during that kind of brief, I suppose, honeymoon period in many ways, for those previously unemployed, now state-employed urban workers, they felt like they had high social status because they were skilled workers. They were skilled urban workers. They had really secure employment. They had kind of wraparound social security and provisions for their children and so on, and housing. And then that was then lost in the later days of the 70s and 80s, as state enterprises were privatized and sold off very quickly. And then the status of Communist Party officials and, party functionaries rose rapidly above that of the workers. And so this comes back to the original question that Sam was seeking out to understand, which is, well, how did we start off with what was nominally at least a workers' revolution that then ended up being a form of concentrating power even more strongly in the hands of the political elite, and dispossessing all of the workers, many of whom were made redundant, or some of whom were left with pensions, but not everyone was given severance or decent pensions. And this kind of disillusionment with the revolution that then happened as those waves of unemployment swept through the state sector in the 90s. So that's the kind of, from the point of view of, I suppose, the class of people that were most benefited by the revolution, who saw their lives really turned upside down by it. That's the kind of in some ways both the positive, the kind of honeymoon period, and then also the falling out of love with the party that came later.
There's an incredibly enigmatic image that you end the book with. Sorry for the spoiler to people who are listening, but you end the book with this enigmatic image of these Communist Party soldiers in 1949 laying down in a village to sleep in distinction, you write, to the Kuomintang, their aggressive and appropriating behavior as they came through the same village. And I've been sort of struggling to work out what it is that you mean by this, because it's a sort of detached paragraph or two at the very end of the book. And I was wondering if you could offer us some sort of gloss on what it meant to place that there. And is there a sort of a similar question that you are raising about where this thing that was supposed to normally be a great equalizer became this structure that actually produced profound inequalities in Chinese society?
So that anecdote at the end of the book comes from one of the many anecdotes that my maternal grandparents who took care of me when I was little, who I lived with before I came to the UK with my parents, have told me. And they were great storytellers, my maternal grandparents. In Chinese, they're called, you call your maternal grandparents 外公外婆. So that's how I knew them. So my Waigong and Waipo were born in that era that you describe, in the late 30s, 40s, pre-revolution, but really came of age just after the Communist Revolution. And they, like many of their generation, just have so many stories of the rapid changes in their lives of that time. And I think they have this kind of quite grandparently way of telling you these stories almost without any embellishment. Or, they have lived through several revolutions in that time. They lived through and survived the Communist Revolution, the Cultural Revolution, all the factional violence of that time, which claimed many lives. And then they then saw their state-owned enterprise kind of restructured, workers made unemployed, now live in a very ultra-capitalist society. And they've managed to weather all these changes in one human life. And so when I was growing up, they'd often just tell me these vignettes of life at different points in their long lives. And what really struck me about that particular vignette of the Communist Party occupying their hometown in Sichuan in southwestern China, where my mum's side of the family is from, is that it was done so quickly and with ease and silently overnight, and how much the most radical changes in a person's life can happen without any warning, without any noise or kind of sounding of cymbals. It was very much a surreptitious and in many ways unforeseen feature. And one of the things I'd like readers to take away from the book is the way that revolutions in the structure of a society, in its psyche, in the way that people relate to each other, can happen without this kind of pre-warning that is heralded when a party like the Communist Party founds a new country, or when a policy is declared, but can happen really surreptitiously and silently.
I was talking to my grandma the other day, and she lived in Southwark, which is in South London for listeners who are not from London, and has lived there since the 1950s.
Oh, wow.
And her view of history is basically that the British Empire is now declining. Right? That is currently her sense of what is happening currently, that Britain's influence in the world is in decline. And her overwhelming sense of what goes on in the world is essentially Whiggish, that there was this period of great ascent and great power, and now there is a period of precipitous decline. And I wonder what kind of view of history as a whole people of your grandparents' age in China have, having lived through such an extraordinary period or rapid change. Does a nihilism set in? Does a sense of reaching back for a greater continuity that defines China as a whole set in? Like, what are the things people reach for in order to understand what history has done to them? Because although these are incredibly large movements at times, and there are certainly in the 60s periods of mobilization of masses of people, by and large, history is something that happens to you, right? And the same is true in China. And I wonder what kind of attitude towards the progress of life sets in.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I would say predominantly most people in China today, of whatever age, expect positive things from the future. There's been 30, 40 years of breakneck speed growth. I think that optimism is coming to an end for reasons we can discuss later in the current generation. But broadly speaking, there's a great sense of the country's going in a positive direction. Certainly, I think this has been very much complicated by the pandemic and the post-pandemic slump. But certainly, in 2019, that was the dominant narrative, and that would have included my grandparents. They would have expected a much brighter future for their kids. In many ways, that aspiration and that expectation then poses difficulties when it meets with economic reality. But I would also say that my grandparents were people who had lived through and survived many different highs and lows in society. And when I was growing up, I would call my grandparents back in China, I would write to them. And no matter what I told her, whether it was good or bad news, my maternal grandma, my Waipo, would always say to me, that's wonderful what you've told me, etc. But remember that life isn't always about ups. It's also about downs. And it's about whether you can weather the downs as well as the ups. You'll never be always on top of the world, and you'll never be always, down in a hole that you can't dig yourself out of. What's most important is that you're able to weather the changes. And I thought that was in many ways really wise advice, because it meant that she didn't only kind of focus on my successes with further reinforcement. She really wanted me to know that actually the thread of history is extremely long. And if you look at my grandparents' own lives, you can see very much how they had huge ups and huge downs in their own life through features that were partly of their control, but partly also of historical, historical accident. And more than anything, she wanted me to understand that was the fundamental of life, was that things could change really radically without you're having any say in the matter.
Let's come on to the 1960s and the Cultural Revolution. I know we've already sort of jumped backwards and forwards between the 30s and the 80s. Let's try and go back to there. And these are things that are happening that are within memory just about of the parents of your characters in the book. So we have the Red Guards, the Little Red Book, which appears at this point, the Four Olds, which I'm assuming are to some extent continuities with the Three Mountains that one is laboring under.
Chinese Communist Party propaganda is really into sets of numbered things.
Right, yes.
Yeah,
The three absolutes. This is the Jamin thing. No, this is the...
I'm actually very bad at Chinese Communist Party slogans, so please don't test me on this.
The three represents. The three represents. That's what it's called.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you talk us through some of the sort of key narratives that you think inform, not just the key narratives for that of what happened in history, but are the key narratives that inform the ways in which people now think about the boundaries of politics, think about what is possible in politics, and also think about what must be avoided. Because the Cultural Revolution was a disaster. Let's be real about this, right? So what is it that people learn from this? And what do people normally now think about that in China?
Well, I think I would pick up on the what needs to be avoided, because in many ways, the Cultural Revolution itself was so traumatizing and destroyed the bonds of trust in communities. And that itself, I think, has led to a great sense of avoidance of politics or of discussions of politics. I think the lesson that was taken from the Cultural Revolution, and again, a huge response to the trauma of the time, is you can't trust people with your secrets. People can turn against you. Of course, the Cultural Revolution played out in different parts of China very differently. But I'm thinking of the major cities that were really affected by it. In Chengdu, for example, the capital of Sichuan, or in Beijing, the capital of the country. In these big cities where we have a decent historical record of what happened, bearing in mind that a lot of the historical record was purposefully lost or destroyed.
When? And by who?
Sorry, you mean how was the history destroyed?
Yeah, whose interests is it to forget that stuff?
Well, I mean, certainly in the ruling Communist Party's interest to forget the Cultural Revolution era. And there are lots of people implicated by that time who are still alive, or who have descendants who are still alive, who haven't answered for any of the atrocities that they committed or the killings, etc. And if you go to any official state-sanctioned museum of Chinese history, it just skips right through the 60s, right? It almost skips from the founding of modern China to the post-Mao era.
Yes.
Because those are really uncomfortable parts for the Communist Party to reckon with. And I think that's also led to this, there's been this kind of smaller movement of people, of historians, of citizen historians, if you like, trying to seek redress, because of course there are families. There are lots of parallels with Tiananmen Square, the massacre in 1989. There are obviously living people whose relatives were murdered, or who were affected by those different atrocities, whose now kind of attempts to seek justice are also in the context of trying to maintain actually a discussion or a living history of those events, which the party would rather forget. And that makes it even more complicated in terms of trying to seek justice, because not only are you trying to find redress, but you're also even trying to find the ability to speak about these incidents at all. So in any case, but to go back to your question of how that's affected people in generations since. So one feature of the inheritance of the Cultural Revolution that I find very present in the Chinese diaspora abroad is not just a feature of the revolution itself. It's not just a feature of the Cultural Revolution itself, but also is, of course, about Tiananmen Square, which is in the living memory of my parents and parents of millennials like me. Is this great fear of politics, this desire to be free from politics, to run away from it, to not be implicated by it, to not be part of any party, and in a sense to kind of keep your head down and have a life not affected by these very violent struggles, or the struggles that can become violent. I think that explains partly why Chinese diasporas in the countries that they resettle in, like the UK or the US, have been I think slow to be part of civic and political life in those countries because of a distrust of those systems.
So let's get to the reform and opening up era, which you already mentioned. Before this, growth was incredibly erratic. So growth in China is incredibly erratic. Around 3% on average, but that's if you average out across the 50s to 60s, 70s. We're obviously talking about a period in which there are massive famines, for example, huge destruction of infrastructure and people. Isabella Weber is very fond of quoting this statistic, which I find absolutely mind-blowing, which is that in the 1980, China had a lower GDP per capita than Sudan and Haiti. Right, so we're talking about an extremely, extremely poor society. Can you talk to us about that period of the beginnings of reform and opening up? So it's how is it first trialed? How is it first received as an instruction from Deng Xiaoping? So there's a very interesting sort of thing about his southern tour and the kind of remarks he makes and so on. And I'm interested in that whole sort of scene there of how this reform and opening up becomes to be sort of possible to think in China.
So Deng Xiaoping's southern tour is credited with making the reforming and opening up era possible, in that before he embarked on this tour, there was still very much a debate within the Communist Party about what model China wanted to embrace. And people were drawing lots of different lessons from Soviet Russia at the time, and what was done well and what was done badly.
This is just after its collapse, right? So this is
yes,
92.
exactly. In the transition, would a similar transition from China lead to the same problems? And I think the Communist Party in China has always been really fascinated with the collapse of Soviet Russia and seeing it really very much as the only kind of comparable state to itself. How do we avoid those same problems? And there are many different historical accounts of this, but Deng, in some ways, kind of forced his own hand by having these explicit conversations with the rulers of the southern province, Guangdong province, which is the province across from Hong Kong, and in particular of the leaders of Shenzhen, which at the time was this kind of fishing village town kind of settlement on the southern shore of China, facing Hong Kong. And within the next 30 years of reform and opening up, had really become one of the biggest beneficiaries of the increased trade, is now one of the richest cities in China. I suppose one thing I'd really want to highlight from that period is how, if you were just a person living in Shenzhen, as for example Sam, one of my characters' parents were. They come from the surrounding villages in Guangdong province. They had been recruited by a government work agency to go and populate the factories and the government offices that were just setting up in Shenzhen, that were trying to build Shenzhen into a modern city. They were really kind of swept along with this project of building a modern, big capitalist city in China that had never existed before. And I think if you were any of their relatives or friends back in the village, you would have seen some of your neighbors, your friends from primary school suddenly become rich beyond your wildest imaginations. And this having happened in a way that seemed quite arbitrary and quite random, because of course different people took different paths through that journey. Some people were the first to jump into the sea, as it was called, which was the slang for becoming an entrepreneur and becoming one of the first waves of private business owners in China. And some of those people really struck it rich. There were lots of, I think, low-hanging fruit and opportunities that had really been repressed through the last few decades of economic mismanagement at the end of the Mao era. And all of a sudden, everything was available and on offer. So I think the mentality I think you would have grown up with, I think my parents' generation mentality is very much of, you can really make it rich, and there's some kind of magical irregularity around this, around who manages to make a fortune and who doesn't, and everyone draws their own kind of probably slightly irrational conclusions from that. And I think there's also, I do think that on a psychological level, that explains partly why in China, compared to many Western countries, there is so much more individual household speculation in the stock market.
Right.
You can strike it rich.
I want to go back to this southern tour thing, because there were these remarks that Deng makes. I don't care if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, which is understood to be a sort of indifference about social structure. I don't care if we have socialism or capitalism as long as we can society can be richer.
Yeah.
And that seems to me in some ways not exactly an avoidance of politics in the way that you were describing after the Cultural Revolution, but certainly a sort of a step back from the depth of political ideology that the Maoist era had instilled in people. But also the other interesting thing here is that in distinction to what you were perhaps saying earlier about Xi Jinping's era, a very centralized state sort of driven policy and state ideology, these are in some ways like loose remarks, which suddenly seem to initiate the largest period of human transformation in history. And I feel like I'm just missing something here. Like, how is it that we sort of concretely go from, these remarks to world scale transformation?
Well, I also wouldn't characterize them as loose remarks. These are, I would say, like carefully calibrated messaging attempts to communicate to a population that's been, that has been raised with the ideology of the Mao era, a graceful enough move to a completely different economic system. So the problem that faces Deng is, how do you start to essentially market the capitalist experiment to a Communist Party set of cadres, and also to a broader public who have been told for decades that this is absolutely the opposite of what the Communist Party stands for. And this is where you start to get the complicated, self-contradictory terms like socialism with Chinese characteristics, and all these kinds of attempts to try to create a different form of socialism in China, which is essentially is not socialism at the end of the day, and actually really never was, even in the Mao era. But there's the very difficult communicating work that he has to do to sell that. So I think that's how I would understand the black and white cat term. It's to prepare people for this coming transition.
That's very interesting. That sort of lever of trying to produce a new kind of person en masse is one of the characteristic levers of the Mao era, which is why you have the sort of study groups, why you have the Little Red Book and so on.
Yeah.
Are those same levers pulled, or is it really quite at the level of that kind of marketing, that kind of catchphrase, that kind of mental preparation? Or is there a broader institutional change that prepares people for this entrepreneurial lifestyle they're now going to be sort of pressured into adopting?
Yeah, it's a good question. My experience of this from, for example, interviewees like Suyue, who grows up in a farming village on the eastern coast. The East Coast is, of course, one of the areas that's most quickly affected by reform and opening up, and benefits from it. Her parents become one of the first entrepreneurs in that reform era. I think there was at the time so much desire to escape poverty as well, that in a way there wasn't the same need to kind of create this, have this government-run project of remaking a citizenship for entrepreneurship. It was more many people seeking their own ways out of the devastations of poverty that their families, their parents, their grandparents had struggled with, and seeking a way out of the farmland, which everyone associated, and to some extent is still associated with stagnation and poverty in China, seeking a path to the city, seeking a path to being your own, being the ruler of your own destiny. And so I think in many ways that entrepreneurial fervor, where it began, I think, in the coastal parts of China, in the South Coast and the East Coast, was more transmitted socially, that you would have, again, you may have been a farmer, but your neighbor would have struck it rich by going to the city, getting on a boat and finding a job, or starting his own radio repair business, as Suyue's dad did. All of these different small things that then can lead to huge transformations in individual lives, and also huge amounts of jealousy, I would say, between the people who made it and the people who stayed in the village, etc. And that was transmitted really rapidly. The sense of there is opportunity out there if you take it.
That's an incredibly powerful motor, jealousy, certainly. A sense that one must keep up with people around you, and therefore, adopt an entirely new style of life.
Yeah, and I was also, part of Suyue's story is also marred by the fact that the government officials in her hometown were extremely jealous of her father's earnings, of her parents' earnings, and this leads to kind of a further saga for them in terms of struggling with the government. So there are lots of jealousies on all sides. One
of the most contentious, I guess, aspects of this story of transformation from the, let's say, beginning of the Communist Revolution to the present is the question of absolute poverty. So the World Bank has these figures that suggest that absolute poverty, so this is people who have almost nothing to eat, right? This is extreme levels of poverty. Those levels are quite high consistently throughout the Maoist period. They spike in certain moments of disaster, and they fall progressively with liberalization, essentially. They fall with the development of markets to levels that are very, very, very low now. There is a different story put about by people like Jason Hickel, which suggests that actually it's in the opening period of liberalization that absolute poverty rates spike. So before that, we had the work unit system, right, that allowed people to meet their basic that allowed people to meet their basic needs. So people were housed, they were fed. They may not have had much beyond that, but levels of absolute poverty are pretty low in that period. And then it's really with the liberalization and the decomposition of this sort of direct communist intervention into the form of life that absolute poverty starts to really take off. And then again, it falls in their picture as well. Through the 80s and 90s, and really starts to fall in the 2000s as well. What do you make of these two competing stories? Where do you stand on this? How do we understand the sort of political dynamics, or the way we can read the story of absolute poverty, which is I'm focusing on because it is in some ways the most obvious success of China in the last sort of 50 years, right? To reduce absolute poverty to very, very low levels.
So I'm afraid I don't know the thing that you mentioned and haven't read his work. But I'm a bit suspicious of that argument about the collapse of the work unit system. So in the 80s, my grandparents, for example, were part of a danwei, what was called a danwei, a work unit, which would have run, not only given you work, but also kind of provided childcare, provided education for children, etc. Been essentially a whole unit that sorted out your entire life. And that work unit system really only covered a very small percentage of the population of China at that time, because it only covered urban workers who worked for state enterprises. And the vast majority of people in China would not have been part of a danwei system. They would have been farmers. So we're talking about, I don't know the absolute numbers, but something like 90% plus agricultural, less than 10% in the danwei system is my guess, not knowing the exact numbers.
I have sort of superimposed the collapse of the work unit system onto Jason Hickel's work. So I'm not imputing that he has made that particular argument. His argument is that that was my fault. He argues that there was this spike around liberalization. I don't think he gives a particular mechanism, but his broad argument, or the way I would at least read the way in which he presents the data, is that it is the force of liberalization and the withdrawing of the state from direct provision, even if people are relatively sort of agriculturally based, right? It's that withdrawal of the state that then produces this problem, which forces people into the city, but they go through a period of intense absolute poverty that otherwise wasn't there in Maoist era China, for example.
Yeah, I don't think that doesn't add up because of the numbers of who was enriched by the danwei system. But I suppose this discussion I think also illuminates another feature of the communist era in China, which is that if you were covered by the social protections because you were part of this class of skilled workers who were lucky enough to be probably party members and also have many political privileges, then you had it made. But for the vast majority of people, that wasn't the case. And so there's also the question of equality, but for whom, and who was benefited at different stages. And it's funny because my grandma, I think, like many urban workers of her time, really has still holds to this day this kind of cultural bias towards seeing her group of people as the rightful inheritors of their privileges. And sometimes when we're walking around my hometown in Sichuan, she'll make remarks like, "Oh, these days the farmers, they're so rich," which are very much about we were the educated or some at least skilled urban class, and they were the peasants, And then there's a little bit of that. There's a lot of that us and them still very much at all stages of Chinese modern history.
Right. Which again, I guess, reflects on the extreme rapidity of this transformation. That equivalent shift in British agriculture, for example, took like 250 years, right? Whereas she's talking about it in the scope of one single life, not even the scope of that in some ways.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, all the social change has been compressed into a few generations in China, and I think that those same changes, as you say, would have played out in the UK over several centuries. And I think that fact itself makes it really interesting to consider intergenerational questions like relationships between grandparents and parents and children,
right.
And also mobility, which is, of course, an intergenerational concept of what's passed down from your parents to you, and how much better or worse than your parents you're expected to do. But obviously operating under a completely different system to the system they operated in. And I mean, imagine if your parents had been born in Victorian era Britain and they were handing down advice about your life and
right.
How to pick your.
In a sense, I feel like sometimes they are. So we have this idea, or in some ways aspiration, that starts to kick in sometime in the 80s and through the 90s and then 2000s, of being middle class. I was wondering if you could give us a sense of what it means to be middle class in the new China, and particularly around property, like ownership of property, but also maybe around this thing you were saying earlier about investment in the stock market at the family level. What are the dynamics of being, or what are the kinds of aspirations that might go into this notion of a new Chinese middle class?
Yeah, I think there's this phrase that's often translated as moderately prosperous, which is the kind of goal of the current era for the Communist Party to achieve a moderately prosperous society. And what it means to be a moderately prosperous family, I think, in China would be best painted by certainly living in the city. So again, this us versus them of the farmland versus the cities, that you'd end up in the city. You might not be in what's called a first tier city, the Beijing, Shanghais, and Shenzhens of China, but in a large city with children who are probably doing well in the academic educational system as opposed to the vocational educational system, and property owning, with a pension, with some kind of job security. And interestingly enough, I think that image of a moderately prosperous or a middle class lifestyle, I think, is increasingly kind of outside of what many urban young Chinese people, so born in the 90s and afterwards, feel like they can achieve, even if they may currently be enjoying the kind of the relative well-off lifestyle of being in the city. And that's to do with many, many different factors. It's partly to do with the two-track form of citizenship in China, where you have a household registration or hukou that ties you to a certain place, even if you're born in the countryside, as as 3 of my 4 female characters in the book are. And if you then move to a big city and then work in the city for a good proportion of your working life, you still don't have status in the city. You still don't have the right to often to buy housing or to settle down, to have your kids go to school in the city or to enjoy social security in the city. And so that separates a lot of young Chinese from their, I guess, dream of urban prosperity. And secondly, it's also just the reality, as we see across across the West as well, of house prices and the importance of family wealth for letting you settle down in a large city if you came from outside of the city.
Does this also explain, I mean, this is one of those, in some ways, curios about modern China that people love to point to, that gives the country almost a sort of freakish look, which is the phenomenon of the ghost city, which is full of investment, but no one actually lives there. It's a mere speculative investment. And I wonder if is the phenomenon of the ghost city wrapped up into the aspirations of becoming middle class, or is actually the phenomenon of the ghost city itself overplayed massively, I think, in the Western media as a story about what China is like?
So I think ghost cities refers to this phenomenon where private developers have built huge amounts of housing in different parts of China where they estimated there'd be great population movement, and then that's just failed to come through. There haven't been the jobs or the other conditions that meant that people wanted to move to those places. And there's essentially been overbuilding and overinvestment there. And then you see these kind of quite spooky towers without windows that are left unfinished forever because there's no economic incentive to finish them or to do anything else with the land underlying them. I think to me they're partly a symbol of the rapidity of change, of how if you're a property developer in China, you grew big by making quite risky bets that turned out well, but not all your bets will turn out well. And so there'll also be the developers who, there'll also be these ghost cities as well. I think it comes from also the extrapolation of, at a time when population movement is really both really rapid, but also changing changing in nature over time, that you try to extrapolate from what works now and you extrapolate too far into the future. Right. I think the part of the ghost city phenomenon that has to do with urban-rural inequality is the forced urbanization aspect. So the fact that the Chinese government has a target for how many people it wants to live in towns, and therefore builds these kinds of quite artificial towns on the outskirts of rural areas, where it's trying to kind of collect and agglomerate a bunch of farmers spread over a large region into a town. But there isn't any economic or cultural or social fabric to that. It's purely kind of invented place. There's a bit of this towards the end of the book where I write about one of the characters June, who grows up in a very remote mountain village. Her grandparents and her parents are being asked if they want to move to the nearest town. And there's also this kind of cultural disconnect of, well, what would we do in a town? What would we do for our livelihood? How would we get by if we didn't have land to farm on? What would it be like to live on the second story without your feet on the ground? And how do we get around the town if we don't know how to read and we can't read the street signs? All these kinds of important cultural ties to their former village life, severed by the forced resettlement of farmers.
One of the things that I think was expected by lots of commentators in the West when China started to develop very powerful and very large middle class was that it would be followed by demands for greater and greater political liberalization. That seemed to be happening for quite some time, certainly in the Hu Jintao era, for example. It seemed like Chinese institutions were opening up, things like the press becoming more free. There's a massive acceleration in the number of Chinese students going abroad and therefore bringing back a huge variety of knowledge from outside China as well. That has now gone into pretty decisive reversal. How do you explain this period of deliberalization or re-centralization under Xi Jinping? Is it possible to explain this at the level of his own proclivities, right, as a ruler? Or is there some sort of more or different structural explanation that we can give for why liberalization has faltered and indeed gone backwards substantially?
So I arrived in Beijing as a foreign correspondent with the Financial Times in 2016, which I think in many ways was coming to the end of this era of relative openness, where foreign journalists could still operate, obviously with great constraints in the country, but where Chinese interviewees were very curious about the West and curious about the outside world, really wanted to understand and wanted to talk to you and engage with you as a kind of emissary of that Western world. And of course, in 2018 and 2019, with the onset of the US-China trade wars and the tariffs and the sanctions against tech companies, there was this increased hardening of China against the West, particularly against the US. And that extended to foreign journalists as a whole. For many of my interviewees in China, they would have seen the world through the dimension of US versus China, and the UK is just kind of like unnecessary kind of detail on that.
This is sort of how I see the world as well.
So that anti-Americanism really did affect, I think, the whole of the foreign correspondence core in China, regardless of whether you were actually American or not. There was obviously the crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong in 2019, 2020. And that, I think, was the start of the recognition among the correspondents there at the time that China was not teetering around this question of what kind of system to embrace in the future, but had gone decisively down the ultra-authoritarian version of the answer to that. And you can see all these kind of interlocking vicious spirals of distrust and essentially of, I think, also a foreign ministry in China and a foreign policy making process that is really captured by counterproductive desires. So I think a lot of foreign policy making in China seems really inexplicable to foreign diplomats in Europe, say, or in the US, because a lot of the time it doesn't achieve its own objectives in terms of projection of soft power or rallying, winning hearts and minds in the West. And I think this can best be explained by the fact that the Chinese state system has become more and more internally facing, so that the ultimate arbiter of your success in the party is your relationship with President Xi and your approval from the center, and not to do with any more objective measures of achievement, being able to sign a certain number of trade deals or being able to have relationships with the foreign world that are productive, and also that there's been, I would suspect, a strong capture of those policy-making processes by the Chinese security state, by the security agencies, by state military bodies as well, and those are kind of running in many ways the power of Chinese politics now. So a previously much more diversified state has now become much more narrow in terms of its objectives.
And yet, some quite impressive things continue to happen, right? So particularly around things like the expansion of green energy technologies, so solar panels. This incredible graph people love to look at, where the price of the average watt of solar power descends precipitously, 5 orders of magnitude over the last sort of 40 years or thereabouts, is in partly a Chinese story, and certainly most of the manufacture of that is looked there. And I want to sort of note a feeling that I have from a mere detail in the world, looking out from the UK, almost awe and respect that myself and lots of my friends who are also on the British left have for China. We experience this feeling of jealousy, looking at our own, relatively unimpressive achievements as a movement, and indeed as a political party. A frustration with the small scaleness of British politics, I think, and a sense that China releases us from some of these sort of mediocrity. And it's also a way in which I invest a lot of hope. The writing I do outside Novara is about social collapse, and people come to me after talks and they're like, how do you maintain hope? And I'm like, unironically, I say, like, look at like China. Right? And this is a very strange situation to sort of see myself in. I find myself having this attitude sometimes, despite myself, almost the sort of the Deng Xiaoping attitude. Yeah. I don't care if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. Like, I don't care if a government is brutally authoritarian, like the contemporary Chinese Communist Party, but as long as it takes climate change seriously, or as long as it prevents absolute poverty from growing in its country. And this is at the very extremes of my moments of intense nihilism. But I'm wondering how you, as someone who had a much more developed and nuanced and sophisticated view of China, would respond to this attitude. Am I simply being too sort of nihilistic about it?
Well, firstly, I would say it's much easier for you, Richard, to say that you don't care about whether the state is authoritarian or democratic if you haven't had friends who are journalists and labor activists jailed by the state in your own lifetime. So I think I'm aware, although obviously I'm quite distant from this tendency on the British left to romanticize China. Yeah. I think it's very difficult to maintain that romanticization if you've ever lived and worked in China. And I think it's important as well to consider that when you look at something from a great distance, it's easier to see the magnificence of it without seeing the political complications of it. So there are many forms of political economic capture by business and state elites in China. Take the green transition as one example, the electricity mix in China is extremely coal dependent still, which means that it's one of the more carbon intensive electricity mixes, and therefore when policies like the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism come into force, this kind of carbon border tax mechanism, that Chinese importers will probably be disadvantaged by that because of the high carbon intensity of their products. And to explain the reason why China is still allowing coal power plants to not just to continue operating, but also even still investing in future expansion, I think is an example of another political economic failure where there's an intersection of regional power in the hands of coal bosses, essentially. They have political alliances and factions in the party that are supporting them. And it's the same kind of question of corporate capture that you would see in many other different contexts in different countries. So I suppose, a place that is when a country is very distant, it's easier not to see those different spiraling things going on. And it's easier to project a sense of, I think, relief and, can we not see this as the hope for the future? When I think of China now, it's difficult for me to be really hopeful because I've seen, for example, the demise of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong.
Right.
And those are kind of real living people who, for example, many of those Hong Kong activists are now living in the UK. It's really difficult to feel optimism when the in my lifetime story of engagement with the Chinese government has been one of increasing despair.
Yes.
I think if you wanted to look to East Asian stories of success in industrial policy outside of China, it's also very much worth interrogating industrial policy in Taiwan, in South Korea, in Japan as well, outside of also the failures of the Chinese system.
Absolutely, yeah. No, my purpose here is to puncture and diffuse the China romanticism on the left for sure, not to deepen it. And one aspect of that is very decisive is not just the plausible genocide that is happening in Xinjiang, but also things like the daily grind, the daily sense of the brutalization of work culture in China, the famous sort of 996 culture. Mm-hmm. People work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. and do that 6 days a week, which is shattering to anyone who's ever tried and done that. And against that, there have been much touted movements that have been elaborately described in the media in the West, things like lying flat movement. And I wonder if you could speak to the sort of significance of these. Are they actually widespread movements, or are they just these isolated movements that have become plucked up like hashtags, sort of, have only a relatively thin layer of actual involvement?
Yeah, what really struck me by the end of the 2010s in China, even in the pre-pandemic era, was the rise of these quite darkly comical memes on Chinese social media and in pop culture discourse around the idea of lying flat, as in giving up on trying to achieve the Chinese dream, accepting that you'll never own property in a city, accepting that you'll always be kind of stuck at a certain level. And with it, this concept of involution, which is an anthropological concept that originally was used to describe an island economy where the farmers there were trying to put in more and more effort, advancing their agricultural techniques, kind of putting in more and more handiwork, but getting exactly the same or even diminishing amount of return. Because there was ultimately a kind of an ecological cap on how much output the island produced. And this becoming a feature of Chinese life in many different contexts. For example, educational competition for housing, competition for jobs, for well-educated graduates, for example, that people felt like they were putting in ever more effort in and getting ever less out of it.
Yes.
And in the book, this really comes through, I think, towards the end of the book in terms of the stories of the women who've experienced this kind of soaring level of social mobility in their early lives with the economic boom, and are seeing the start of the decline of those possibilities. And this another phrase that comes up quite often is this feeling of having missed the last bus out to prosperity, that there were a certain number of places left and you've missed it. So there's this huge kind of zero-sumness in all of these metaphors for life. And I think one of the things that obviously that humor does is, it's a form of making light of the problems that people are facing. And in many ways, it's a kind of anti-aspirational solidarity with people saying, look, we were all told as kids that we would do well. If we tried hard, we'd succeed. But hey, we're just going to give up and lie flat. And in a way, it's a very I think healthy cultural response, actually, to be able to make light of those things and to joke about it and to have and to talk about it, actually. And of course, the government is very unhappy with the rise of these memes, and they're certainly seen as not promoting. So the phrase is not promoting positive energy. But I think it's sometimes good to embrace some negative energy.
The final question I want to ask is about Xinjiang, which is how we should understand the suppression of the Uyghur minority in that province. It's also a story of urbanization, right? It's also a story of importing Han Chinese people into that region for them to do the relatively skilled jobs, and then getting people, the Uyghur population, to do the more sort of simpler tasks, right? So it's also a story about urbanization. It's also a story about work discipline. How do you understand this this scene of what is happening here?
Of course, there's a lot to say on the history of the camps in Xinjiang, and the early reporting that was done in 2017-18 about the expansion of detention camps and mass internment and so on. But in terms of the modern day phenomenon of what's happening in Xinjiang and across China, one of the last pieces that I published at the FT at the end of last year was an investigation that we did, a large data investigation into the spread of mosque, not just mosque demolitions, which are obviously very well known of in Xinjiang, but also mosque modifications. So this phenomenon across China, not just in Xinjiang, but everywhere from Beijing, north, south, east, west of China. Not just in Xinjiang, but also across China, including in Beijing, for example, of local governments seeking to modify mosques with features that they deemed too Arabic.
Yeah.
To become these quite uncanny mixtures of what the party sees as traditionally Chinese elements like pagoda roofs and sloping tiles and all of these different kinds of features, morphed onto what previously were intact Middle Eastern style mosques. And I think through writing that investigation and looking at all these pictures of mosques that had not been actually removed, but modified in a way that was, defaced their Arabic elements. It was part of the party trying to redefine what Chinese Islam meant and trying to find a Sinified form of Islam that was essentially a Hanified, as in like the Han ethnic majority form of Islam. And I think to me that also symbolized not just the desire for control at the level of economic control, physical control over people, but also an ideological control over what it means to be a Muslim in China, and to be able for the party to kind of essentially capture and dominate that ground. And I think the great tragedy, of this as well is that in the same way that the Communist Party is trying to seek a monopoly over what it means to be culturally Chinese, I think the kind of dual tragedy of this is both in erasing the history of Islam in China, which has had many diverse influences from outside of and within China. The Communist Party of China is also raising, in many ways, the meaning of Chinese culture within China, because to say that everything that is culturally Chinese is Communist Party linked is then also a way of kind of destroying the culture itself. So I think that's the dual tragedy that the Communist Party's created.
We're very likely to see a Labour Party in power. You may well be one of their MPs at the next election. What should British foreign policy towards China be?
I think the first thing to say is to go back to your point about industrial policy, and that I think having witnessed the trade war between the US and China, which achieved, I think, very few objectives on either side, that the first thing to do, the first place to start in terms of fears of economic dominance, of Chinese economic dominance, is to actually start at home and improve our own domestic economy, which God knows could do with some help right now. I think that, when I speak to European business people, for example, German business people operating in China, about what they would like to see happen in their home countries, that's very much the dominant call that I see now, which didn't really exist, I think, 10 years ago, that there is much more expectation from businesses that they will go into economic competition with China, not just on their own, just standing on their own feet, but also with the backing of their governments, with an industrial policy strategy that takes into account their existing advantages and vulnerabilities in the Chinese supply chain. And I think that kind of call from, for example, German businesses is something that completely is the opposite of what those same businesses would have said before the last 10 years. And I think the second thing then is, again, taking across learnings from the way that different European countries and the EU have embarked on new China strategies, is often different parts of one government have very different goals when it comes to its relationship with China. And this is really I think, exemplified by the long and quite kind of messy way in which the German government embarked on its own review of China strategy. I very much support the Labour policy that we would do our own review that is cross-departmental, because I think it would be bad for foreign policy objectives in China, for the UK towards China, purely to be dominated by either only military or only trade, let's say, objectives, and instead should obviously encompass a wide range of those. And I think what's happened, if we look at the reverse of Chinese policy making towards the West, is that it's now become dominated by security objectives above all other objectives. And that makes it very difficult actually to have functioning diplomacy that exists on many different levels and different channels.
Do you see an increasingly two-way exchange of soft power happening, like as a prediction?
What do you mean by exchange of soft power?
So I don't know if this is particularly the case in China, but Britain is Britain hits well above its weight in terms of soft power globally, in terms of exporting institutions, exporting cultural forms, and so on, particularly like music and film and so on. That's sort of started to be the case with China, but it's been a much less effective soft power player than, say, South Korea or obviously Japan was in the 80s and 90s, right? So I'm wondering if you see that as increasingly a dimension of Chinese global power and the way in which it affects the world.
Chinese soft power projection is completely different, I think, in the global south compared to the global north. And so I think you have to take those two things really, really differently. And of course, soft power projection in China in the global south has been largely about economic investment, trade, the Belt and Road Initiative, and also the increasing numbers of foreign students going to China for education.
Yes.
In the rest of the world, in the global north, this goes back to what we were discussing about the dual tragedies of the Communist Party seeking to monopolize Chinese culture. I think soft power and cultural exports from China will be increasingly tainted by association with the government, and I think that's obviously something not in the control of any individual Chinese artist, pop star, footballer, business person, and I think it's also been. If you take the US as the US, particularly under Trump, as kind of the most extreme version of this, also kind of a tragedy of cultural understanding from both sides that, yes, in China, in order to be a business person, you have to coexist with the party. That does not mean that you have to be a member of the party or in many, in hoc to the party. There is a spectrum of how much independence you can have depending on the size of your business, what sector you're in, et cetera, et cetera. I'm really concerned about the increasing xenophobia in foreign policy tendencies, which takes China as one blob where everything is connected to the party, and mistakes all these different forms of relationship as just being the same thing. And at the same time, there is a real risk that China continues to pose to the Uyghur diaspora, to the Hong Kong diaspora in the UK, for example, that we really need to guard against. And I think it's really important to be absolutely clear about both the risks and the opportunities of engagement with China without merging all these different things.
And of course, the risk to Taiwan as a possible, as an independent state. Yuan Yang, thank you so much for coming on Novara FM. There were loads more questions I wanted to ask you, but unfortunately, that is all we have time for.
Thank you for having me.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support or face the consequences.